We've been waiting for this one. So has Melanie, apparently. She's been practicing all weekend. No, she's not. So Melanie Hui is a good friend of Splice. She works at Luminate. She is here to talk about how to build a long-term relationship with your donor. If you are starting up or if you have a startup that needs funding, Melanie is someone you need to know in this space, and you want to build a long-term relationship with her. That's why she's here today, to talk about how to go about doing that. Melanie, all 5 people are yours.
I know. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Rashad. I'm really delighted to chat with you all today. I'm going to share my screen now, and let's watch it be ridiculous. Can you see all my notes, as is normally the case?
Coming up. No,
all your slides, all your notes, everything. Yeah.
All your jokes. We're laughing ahead of
All
you.
my jokes, exactly. So thanks so much again. Before I start, I was hoping to do a poll of just to get a sense of the people in the room and where you're at. Could you wave to me or post in the chat if you're from a media outlet or a journalism organization and you're completely new to the world of grants and philanthropic support? Got it. Thanks. Keep it coming. Okay, I'm just trying to get a sense of the audience. All right. So I know I don't need to tell this group about the crisis of ad-driven media business models, which has made philanthropic donations and grants an increasingly attractive source of revenue for media outlets outside kind of the traditional press freedom and media advocacy groups who have long tapped into this kind of philanthropic funding. At the same time, we're seeing donors see independent media and free expression as a really critical pillar of good governance. Philanthropists often focus on the public service function of media to achieve goals that they may have around things like promoting pluralism, democratic dialogue. So the stats I have up there are best estimates and a bit old, but the headline here is that in the past decade, media organizations have been awarded hundreds of millions of dollars in grants that go to their journalists and to journalism projects, and that the number of funders and dollars, though in fact this is a very small slice of the overall aid and philanthropic funding buckets, it does appear to be growing. In 2018, there was a CIMA analysis of global aid flows, and it said that from a period of 6 years, from 2010 to 2015, key aid funders that don't include China, that is, funded media development to the tune of $2.7 billion. And in 2015, you can see the number up there. In terms of private philanthropic dollars, 1.9 billion was apparently committed via almost 50,000 grants that same year. I should say that this number is probably deceiving because the vast majority of it is from US-based funders to US-based organizations. But the point is that there is philanthropic capital and aid funding to be accessed, especially for media outlets with any kind of public service, public interest bent, and especially in parts of the world where press freedom is seen to be under threat, which is increasing places these days. At the same time, perhaps maybe you have some familiarity with small grants for various journalism projects, but I get the feeling that for many media outlets outside the nonprofit ones, it may be a little mysterious how to access this capital. To be honest, there is this information deficit between about philanthropy for media and how to access it. And part of this comes from the asymmetry between the funder and the grant seeker. And because of this situation, I thought I could use this session to really help demystify some of this stuff. The spoiler here, though, is that raising philanthropic dollars is really not rocket science at all. In fact, like many things in life, successfully raising funding is just really about cultivating relationships. So, to that point, when Alan said my topic was about building long-term relationships with your donor, while I was definitely keen to share some hopefully helpful insights about the philanthropic funding world, couldn't help but feel a lot of these principles were somewhat analogous to other sorts of long-term serious relationships, in which case, in this talk, I'm going to play something of a advice columnist maybe and give you some unsolicited relationship advice. And during the Q&A, we can, do Aunt Agony style question and answers. There are, unfortunately, many unhealthy, codependent, dysfunctional, transactional, untransparent funder grantee relationships out there. Probably no small part because of funders themselves, but anyway, those though pretty quickly end in breakups. So my plan today is to walk you through some of the tips to help you build something that's more mutually supportive and beneficial. And I'm going to try my best to limit sounding entirely like an advice column here. This is going to be most relevant for media outlets that are looking for grants rather than pure investments. I think Kevin Brocklin at MDIF did a really great job of explaining kind of that fundraise and equity raise at Beta earlier in the month. And I'm also going to focus on philanthropy that's more geared towards underwriting kind of the core cost of your business rather than grant programs that I think people are generally more familiar with, which are kind of short-term by design, things like given to specific journalists for fellowships, for training, grants for specific investigations, that kind of thing. So I should note also that in certain climates that you are more well aware of than I am probably, foreign funding, which is often the case, of media businesses is considered heavily suspect by governments of the day and really could undermine your credibility. So there's also something to consider as you start to pursue kind of philanthropic funding. Let's see, next. Okay, briefly, where is my hot take coming from? I'm Luminate Southeast Asia Director, as Alan and Richard kindly introduced me. I've been in philanthropy for a decade, and before this, I've also done a stint as a fundraiser. Luminate, briefly, was founded by eBay's Pierre Amidia and his wife Pam, with the mission of helping build more fair and just societies. And we've supported about 300 organizations in 18 countries, over $378 million of funding in the past 10 years. Luminate has 4 impact areas, which include independent media, and I work across all 4, with a focus on Myanmar and Indonesia. We also have a specialized independent media team led by my colleague Nishant, who just spoke last week, that funds global media initiatives. Okay, so over the years, while at Luminate and even before that, I funded a range of organizations. We've made a small number of equity investments, including in media outlets, but the bulk of our funding really goes to grants to nonprofit organizations and social enterprises. And these range from really established NGOs to quite small startups. And the reality is that for-profit media organizations, even those that are quite established and have their stuff together, they're just not as used to raising money, grant money, and working with philanthropists as nonprofits for whom fundraising is really their revenue model. Okay, back to the talk, and back for a second to this marriage relationship analogy. I think it's an understatement to say that it's really challenging times for independent media, and at the rate at which advertising is retreating, and given that philanthropy is pretty scarce, especially in this region, Southeast Asia, it can only be a stopgap measure as media businesses transform. But in the meantime, a good supportive relationship with your funder can be really helpful to make it through this. If you do have funders now, the main operating principle is that what you're trying to do is get them to be more committed to you. And if you don't yet, there's still lots that you can do up front as you cultivate relationships to build a foundation of trust that will serve you well later. You want to move things from being transactional and one-off. It's really much less like buying a car and more in the vein of a long-term business partnership. Donor stewardship is really not a one-off thing. It really takes effort. So why is it worth putting in this effort to begin with? The obvious answer is that more money and other kinds of support, and the kind of support that's ideally most helpful to you. And the other point is retention. Having a small group of committed funders cuts down the acquisition cost of fundraising, bringing on new supporters. And then not all funders have transparent or clear processes or goals. And so the inside track is generally quite helpful. So types of funders. Then caveat is all the funders are different, and even within groups of funding kind of buckets, they're also different and they operate in different ways. Their structures and processes do change how much you're able to proactively build these long-term relationships. Many funding organizations just don't really currently have processes that enable long-term and non-transactional relationships. And just like specific, journalism grants that might cover like COVID reporting right now, for example, there are funding organizations that just focus on a certain stage, a specific issue, a specific geography. So your organization might not be a fit, or the overlap is really a time-bound, project-bound one. As you see, a bunch of different funding organizations, there is a very small universe of funders that just back journalism for the sake of its own intrinsic good. But there are a bigger pool of funders who fund journalism now more as a means to an end. For example, they care about climate change or gender or peace rights. And I'm noticing that their interest in media and storytelling is increasing and increasingly part of their theories of change. That's another $100 social sector word for you to look up. What unites these funders versus your advertisers, your investors, is that their orientation is really meant to be mission driven. Okay, so what does a healthy long-term relationship look like? The ideal thing is to get flexible funding. In foundation speak, this is general operating support or unrestricted support that will enable you to put funding towards where you need it the most at the time, which could be overheads, hiring a key staff, or innovation like trialing out a membership program. And it'll allow you to pivot if this is not working out. The next best option is flexible program support that enables you to invest in resourcing the things that you want to. It could be a specific product that you know you want to launch, like an aggregator thing or an elections promises tracker or something like that. Ideally, you'll get program funding in multiple and successive rounds. And if your funder is launching a new fund, or has won, say, a new contract, an RFP from another bigger funder and can provide you sub-grants, they'll approach you because they know and they trust you. They trust your organization and your reputation. The other thing that you want to get, hopefully, is multi-year funding. And as well, non-financial help. Other things like connections to other funders, getting beyond the kind of tricky invitation-only issue with a lot of philanthropy. You want emergency contacts, you want resources, connections, the whole gamut. And in a time of crisis, the idea is that hopefully they'll pitch in for you because you already have a trusted relationship. I find that giving like funding cycles for philanthropy, many foundation funders are just not very able to move very quickly to meet emergency needs. So it moves a lot faster if they already have a prior relationship with you. And ideally, this relationship will be a two-way street. So although, ideally through close collaboration with you, your funder will be able to learn alongside you, and this will help them as they shape their own strategy, as they do their reviews of their giving, of their processes. Okay, relationships take time to build, and active donor stewardship is something you'll want to build capacity in-house for if you want to go the route of accessing increasing amounts of philanthropic funding. I'm just going to run through some practical tips here of how to build a robust relationship with your funder. In the early days, alignment is really important, and you want to build as much interest and alignment as possible. We're talking about the foot in the door kind of stuff that you started to do during your fundraising process, like going through their websites, pull reports, see what studies they've commissioned, what statements they've made in the press about the things that they care about, and other things that they've funded in the past. If a lot of that stuff is not on their website, to get a picture of what the specific funder's interest is in your organization. As we talked about earlier, there are a lot of different types of funders with various interests. So you really want to be clear what they specifically care about. You've used all this kind of research already thus far to help articulate your vision of your organization and your mission statement and frame it in a way that resonates with this funder in order to get the funding. If you've already put lots of effort into this kind of donor research already, and you've used it to cultivate the funder and close the deal, you're already ahead of the game. But sometimes, if not, you've received funding maybe because in response to a call or a project grant that has a very simple application process. Now's the time to do the legwork to see if it makes sense to kind of convert this funder into a long-term supporter. Post-funding, it doesn't help to get even more savvy with the language of foundations, things I've been using like mission and impact metrics, theory of change. Now that you have an in, it's also really useful to use it to get clear on their strategy, because what's on a website doesn't always reflect what's going on now for many reasons. And it's also time to get clear on their processes. For example, what's their funding cycle like? Even if they say it's rolling grant making, budgets are still set at a certain time of the year. Dockets do fill up early at a certain time of the year. And it helps get a sense of where they're at in advance of any time you're going to have your grant renewal, or maybe you want to time well a separate ask for a separate program from the one you're already getting funded to do. Trust is really important, and because of scarcity of funding baked into the funder-grantee relationship, is some imbalance, unfortunately. It's a structural thing that really undermines trust. And it's the thing that incentivizes the grant seeker to become a salesperson, and a salesperson with maybe too much hustle and over-promise and over-self-promote. And then the grant maker simultaneously is also on the alert for being sold. So it's not, an easy relationship to begin with, to be honest. And acknowledging this dynamic, I feel, is a way of bringing back some balance, but it's obviously not a one-sided thing that you can do alone. On your part, a couple things that I think build trust. As you're sketching out the grant activities, do articulate a compelling vision as the hook, but then be realistic about what your deliverables are, your milestones, what you need to get done, and the funding you need, the realistic sense of funding you need to get it done, so that you won't be in a position later of having made promises that you won't be able to keep. During the process, let them get to know you, your funder, the what's and all. I find as a grant maker doing due diligence, I'm skeptical if everything is too perfect. I'm well aware that the landscape is difficult and sometimes dangerous, and it just doesn't build up too much trust if it all seems like a bed of roses that doesn't seem like realistic. One thing that does breed distrust is if a grantee has had the opportunity to disclose significant issues during diligence, and they don't, and it only emerges soon later. I think that is a sure sign that a relationship is kind of built on shaky ground. During the grant, likewise, I think we want to strive for a really candid and transparent relationship. Overall, sharing issues as they emerge and being vulnerable helps build trust. Don't let your funder find out bad news through the grapevine. Investment. Now we're getting to the point where we want to move our donor into becoming a partner. Some funders are more institutionally set up to do this, like their grant-making team's objectives include having a close relationship with their grantees. Others may not, however, because there's a situation maybe where the grant maker just has so many grantees on their docket and they just don't have time to be so high touch. Either way, inasmuch as your primary contacts in the foundation world have time and bandwidth, you want to set things up to maximize the chances that they're invested in you rather than the other grantees, and you want to turn them into a champion for the work that you're doing within their own organization. This is where the effort I mentioned earlier really comes into play. The goal is to get your donor to feel really invested in your success in a methodical way where the engagement still remains pretty genuine. So it means things like being proactive with your communication, make it a habit to have regular touch points beyond and separate from the reporting requirements that's already stipulated in your grant agreement. My take is that it's really rare that you're so aligned on mission and everything with the funder and everything is always going well, that you can just like submit your grant report and then get a re-up in funding immediately. So share your success in the meantime, which gives them something to celebrate and maybe honestly get some credit for within their own organizations. And if you're doing things like considering a strategy pivot or want to brainstorm on some kind of future project, would your funder be someone good to engage with? As appropriate, obviously you don't want to kind of bombard them, but ask for advice. Can you get them more invested by making them part of the sausage making, so to speak? And things beyond the money, what else can they bring? For sure, they have a network. Could they help with recruiting, board advice, etc.? It's not hard to do any of the things above, but it does take time. Time that you probably don't have because you're, running a media business or a newsroom. And yet, you're also the one that the funder wants to be in touch with, rather than somebody that you could delegate to who might have a more limited view of the organization. In large, well-run nonprofits, the trick is that all of this is facilitated by a professional fundraising team or fundraiser who keeps the trains running. This person drafts and personalizes communications, manages schedule, sets up meetings, and then trots out the key person, you, out as needed. So something to know as you think about building this and building capacity to do effective fundraising. Fourthly, mutual respect. So this is another one where obviously it takes two to tango. But if you've succeeded in stewarding your funder thus far, hopefully they're also reciprocating on this front. Quick things like don't make it difficult for the grant maker. You've learned about their processes so you can make the most of it in seeking more funding. But also on the operational side, grants management doesn't have to be harder than it needs to be. And so keep track of when your reports are due, when the evaluations are due, and submit them on time, please. They should care most about the impact that you're making, but it's the small things that count when you want somebody firmly in your corner. I have to admit that despite the fact that it's literally the grant maker's job to facilitate the grant and they couldn't achieve their goals without you, their grantees, it doesn't mean that sometimes they don't act like they know more than they do. Also, while funders of media development would really typically respect editorial integrity, things like your intellectual property, perhaps there are other funders who are newer to media funding and see media outreach as more a means to an end. That might overstep and might want to work in a different way. So this might be a red flag. As you sign the contract, there may be other incidents of funder outreach that may occur later. The point is not to be afraid to fight and hopefully make up, because in the future that will lead to a stronger relationship and more alignment and trust. And if it does cause a rift in the relationship, it may be in many cases better to let this funder go, even if that's pretty hard, I know, because these things would be obviously, as you know, things that would undermine your organization's reputation in a climate where philanthropic funding of media already could be a cause for vilification. Finally, embrace the difficult conversations. There may be things going on in your organization that may be red flags to a funder that's been already funding you that have emerged since they made the grant. And you might think that may undermine the renewal later. They may have mentioned to you in passing, but if they exist, you really want to know what they are and see whether you can do something if you want to continue this relationship early. Finally, continuity. So your people move jobs and your main point of contact in the funding organization will likely leave at some point as well. And you want to make sure that the relationship lasts long beyond that. I don't think it's wise to overtly go around your grant lead, because I've seen that happen and it sometimes undermines the primary relationship. So you should feel like you can ask for the appropriate introductions or use soft touch ways of making more connections, introducing yourself to other people at conferences, etc. The reality is that philanthropic organizations and bilaterals are also not structures that stay the same all the time. They get new leadership, the leadership has a new vision, or the government of the day changes and priorities change. So overall, over a period of several years, you'll see that the priorities of your funder may shift in a way that's less about what's going on with your organization or what's going on in your market, and more about an HQ and people far away. Perhaps there may remain some way of you pivoting alongside your funder if it still makes sense to you when they do that. But otherwise, the best you can hope for is probably for the organization to provide you, after you've been a grantee for so long, advance notice that from your grant lead, and maybe even introductions to other funders. They might also be able to kick in what we call a soft landing or a sunset grant. So even if the relationship ends, this might not be permanent. I'd say keep in touch, probably a lighter touch way. But if your priorities match again, you want them to think of your organization. So try to remain top of mind. A lot of this requires you, that I've said today, requires you to have a funder relationship already. And obviously it's easier to do when you already have somebody who's invested in you and is already in your court. But I think even if it's a funder who's gotten to know you a bit and even had to pass on funding for whatever reason, you can still keep up the relationship. And it may be a chance to reintroduce your organization down the line, and it hopefully will pay off down the road. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
How amazing was that? Have you ever had a situation where you were on the way to, building something that was a bit more permanent, and you discovered something about the grantee that wasn't disclosed earlier, and you had to walk away from the deal late into the process?
I think if it's a massive red flag, we definitely would have to. But I think the main thing is that we all know that all organizations, funding organizations themselves, all organizations have issues. We're working in a very tough space. So it's never about perfection, but it is about trust. If there is something that is, obviously some things like a massive harassment case, it would be we would have to walk away because we wouldn't be able to trust the leadership,
Yeah.
for example. But if it was other things, even a transition, lots of things come up, it wouldn't be a cause for that kind of thing. But we would want to know. I think it's more undermining if we didn't know and it was disclosed later, and it happened. We find out later.
What is one thing that you've uncovered in one of your duties that scared the hell out of you?
Sorry, before that, Melanie, do you want to stop sharing your screen?
Oh yes, I do want to stop sharing my screen. Stop presenting.
Yay. Done. Here we are. Sorry, go for it.
There are many things, like we find out that actually a key person within the organization is about to move on. And the people know about that. That does happen and is quite a natural thing. But if it's not disclosed, I mean, sometimes there are other things related to healthy workplace issues. That's another one that comes up fairly often. I'm smiling at Danita, my colleague. Those are some things.
Okay. No, nice. I wanted to point out that, those of you who are media startups in this chat, or in fact are planning to be media startups or launching a product like some of our friends here are going to, I'm looking at you, Dorothy and Corinne. But listen, if you guys have experiences about funding or questions about funding, we'll ask you to go loud later. I had a question, Melanie. It was basically, something that we hear a lot of, and something that at Splice we try and sort of, it's a rigor that we try and inculcate. But does every good business plan have to include a plan for revenue?
Yes, but revenue is different for different organizations. We fund some nonprofit media, and their revenue is foundations. But yes, a plan for that is really important. I like to see a 2-year cycle, and what is hopefully it's always more convincing when there's 50% of the revenue that's already available this year and some of it next year. You kind of see that continuity. You feel that if you're funding this organization, it's not that they're unfortunately going to collapse overnight, which does happen.
Right. So I could just come to you and say, look, I don't have a plan. I'm doing journalism. I'm talking about people who really need to be talked about. I have no clue how I'm going to make money, but please give me money.
Yeah, that generally doesn't work that well.
I thought I'd cover all the bases. Yes, okay.
Right.
But it happens a lot.
Right.
That's the funny thing. Okay, fair enough.
Ava, why don't you jump in? You've got a good question here.
Sure. So I work a lot in the space between donors and media outlets, and I face a whole lot of pressure, like basically the pressure for the pitch to be sexy, right? And to sound like we found this new tech thing that's going to fix everything, and look at our dozens of products that are going to come out of it. And I think everybody knows it's not going to work, but still when proposals are evaluated and they're counting up points, a lot of times it just becomes a numbers game. I think I had a little spreadsheet. I'm a data journalist. I had a spreadsheet. I intercepted proposals that promised 847 investigative pieces by the end of the year. And I was like, I think that's more investigative pieces than the entire world produces in maybe several years. So I keep going back to this problem of how do we get away from, when it's both media houses and donors trying to chase the shiny thing, trying to fix everything. And how do you get both? How do you get people writing proposals, and as donors, how do you get away from that?
Yeah, I think it's one of these really difficult things. There's been a whole bunch of media and philanthropy studies that have been produced lately, and a lot of them are basically written and interviewing grantees and portfolio organizations to tell funders, like, you're doing this wrong. Stop giving short-term funding. Stop chasing the shiny new thing, as you said, Eva. It's one of the things that funders need to talk about more within themselves. I mean, I think it's good that we're critiqued as well, actually, in public, maybe. But they are, these conversations are happening, but I think it's still, there's always this thing that exists. It's kind of a bit human nature, which is not very satisfying. and something that hasn't been easily broken. The other aspect of it is funder fragmentation. Everybody is funding bits of different things, and really what you want to look at the ecosystem approach, and trying to shore up things across multiple where they relate. It isn't one of these things, besides kind of more critiques about it and more education amongst ourselves, and I guess more conferences. Not that any of us want to attend more of them. It appears to be that this past year was all about like digital rights. Everybody was funding that conferences. So there we go.
So wait, you mean virtual reality is not going to save journalism?
AI for media, blockchain for media.
With a question mark at the end.
D of Plates magazine. I mean, could you make a magazine where I could just point my phone at the food and something happens, like magically? Come on. No? I don't see that. Oh, wait, D, you're on mute. Sorry.
It's like smell-o-vision, but for magazines.
That's right.
I came
Come on, bring it back.
Fund me, somebody.
Scratch and sniff.
Fund me. You heard it here on beta. Smell-o-vision. Oh, I'm sorry, D. Your mic isn't working, but you are also on mute. All right. Listen, unmute yourself at some point. Corinne, you want to come back in with your comment? It's more valuable if you say it out loud.
Oh, okay, sure. Hi, everyone. That was great, Melanie. Thank you so much. Yeah, my question is, it's not related to the product that I'm allegedly organizing as part of the Splice Inspo, but it's more around, if you have a journalistic mission and a clear idea, perhaps you've researched it with a specific audience, how do you not do what Richard did? In other words, how do you work with donors where it may not necessarily align with their priorities? And you've just mentioned, digital security, and in 2018 it was press freedom, and so how do you sort of build connections that make sense, even if you're not necessarily going to do business right away?
Yeah, I think it is a reality. Like it was not flippant saying maybe it's not worth working with some funders, because I know the stress that media organizations are facing. There is a risk, if you do too many of them, that what you end up doing is being a kind of contractor for the funders' kind of own projects and ideas, and then your funding pool is made out of 15 different projects that are small, giving you bits of money and don't really cover overhead, and it transforms your organization in a very negative way. I think in a way, like membership, like even though people are just trialing memberships and subscriptions and other things that are non-ad, obviously, they give you more control than a lot of funders do give you. The holy grail is obviously unrestricted, multi-year funding. There are not many funders out there that are doing that, and many funders have, even if they have some sort of social mission, they have other kind of reasons why they're investing in things and quite specific strategies and targets. The donor research in that case, like for long-term relationships, would be like really looking for those that really align with your long-term goals, even if it's really hard to turn down readily available, all the RFPs that are always kind of churning through the system. I don't really know what to do with them, really, those things, because they seem to be useful, obviously, for media organizations, but also really challenging in the kind of long-term ecosystem.
Hey, Melanie, when you're looking into your crystal ball and looking at where things could be next year, what do you see in terms of the media landscape post-COVID, or in the middle of a COVID transition still? And firstly, what do you see? And secondly, what do you want to see?
Alan, I'm really worried because you produced that survey, your Splice Lights On survey, or MDIF's very good survey on Myanmar media as well. Those things those surveys showed that our media organizations in this region are under severe stress because of COVID. I think that's obviously not news to anybody. Ironically, we found that those that had profits from advertising were actually the ones that are hurt more than the ones that were already based on philanthropy and non-profit media organizations, because those kind of have a different shelf life. The revenues didn't disappear overnight, unlike kind of people who are still using advertising. So next year, I am concerned about what we will see in the landscape after. I think it is time. What I hope to see is that it's a time of innovation. People get lean. I know some organizations we funded stopped publishing their printed version and they went digital. They weren't able to do the events, so they were looking at other kind of products. This pivot is not necessarily a positive thing, because it undermines some of the innovations that they were already trialing now, but something hopefully positive in terms of kind of lean and right-sized organizations that can kind of work through difficult times that are ahead, is what I hope to see, like more innovation in this front. I don't know whether people are sharing enough, because it's kind of under a lot of, I know organizations are under a lot of stress, but I hope to see innovations that come out of it that kind of make sense for like kind of a leaner models for newsrooms, etc.
Yeah, I hear you on that innovation front. Adversity being, what it is and all that. PTB, you're up. Ask your question.
I should ask PTB questions.
Yeah. No, this was fantastic, Melanie. I applaud you, because I loved all the cartoons and the relationship building. And I think I'd like to say that without relationship building, whether it's traditional investment funding or as everything that Melanie very well so pointed out, you're going to find yourself chasing those shiny stars. And I think waiting till you need the money and you're desperate for it is possibly the worst possible time to do this. So, get to know the Melanies of the world, get to understand what Luminate does or doesn't do it. It's just as important. And then I think something else that, if I can add, Melanie, don't know if you agree, but if you get declined for a proposal, it's always really good to follow up and ask if they're willing to share with you why they turned you down.
Yep.
Because oftentimes those are great lessons. And I just want to say that we had a situation last year where someone was reaching out to every donor, every investment team. They were desperate. They needed help in 10 days. It's impossible.
Way. It's impossible.
I mean, maybe somebody like Free Press Unlimited, but even Free Press Unlimited had to turn them down because there was no relationship.
Yeah.
Nobody knew. They didn't know each other. And so it was a difficult situation. So I cannot underline 10 million times Melanie is spot on the relationship building.
There are I totally agree with you, Pat, about kind of asking early and asking for feedback. There is also just like funding leads have budgets for a year. Maybe the budget is set, so they don't want to have a conversation with you because it means that they're not ready to enter a funding discussion. And if you have it too early, it kind of creates expectations. So the no could be because of that, not no forever. But of course, then it would be on you to kind of keep top of mind as a grant seeker, because of course, funding leads have a full docket often because there is scarcity of funding in this landscape. There's no doubt about that.
If I could jump in again with another one of my silly questions. What are some of the questions that you wish more people would be asking you, Melanie? I mean, very often obviously you get all these applications and you're like, hey, you should be asking me this. What is that one thing or two?
I think I do get a fair number of pitches that are boilerplate. They're not customized for Luminate. And so the thing is that Luminate is a funder that actually puts a ton of its stuff on its website. So we have our strategy, especially, you can go to the page of our media strategy and all our media investments, for example. but I do wish that when I have have these introductions with grant seekers, that they are asking me about kind of the nuts and bolts of my strategy and how to understand it better. So maybe in general, you see what Luminate is about, but how does this appeal? Like, how does this apply to your specific bucket of the funding in this specific region? I would say other things. People are pretty good at the nuts and bolts of like, what's the process? What do we need to provide you? All of that is the fairly straightforward things that people are more likely to ask. They're less likely to ask about other organizations that we fund that could be helpful to them. Like, oh, I see you also working with Finance Uncovered in a global media like transparency organization. Could I have connections to them? So like other ways beyond the money. So it makes it a bit more transactional. But if you can grow the relationship of these other richer conversations that go beyond the money, to introductions to Pat, for example, or the Cool Splice team, like people, grantees seem to be quite focused in these conversations, but there is a lot more beyond the funding that could be gathered. We do at Luminate something called partner support, which focuses on we're giving you grant money to do the projects you want, but there may be specific things like maybe it's hiring a consultant to build a better board. Maybe it's specific things on news, something for your newsroom. These things can be asked for too, but it has to be that there has to be a two-way kind of openness about like, we're having problems in this front. So I would be keen to hear from people who ask about the possibility of supporting things beyond the grant.
Our buddy Jan Oak
Jan.
has a good question. Jan, you want to go live?
Yeah. Hi, Mel. Thanks for the talk.
Hi, Jan.
Yeah. So my question was, if we look at a lot of media and CSOs in the region, they do tend to fundraise from Western donors and a lot of Western government donors as well. Have you seen a lot of successes with fundraising from local philanthropists? Like, for example, in Singapore, there's lots of like foundation money and stuff, and even in my country, there's like lots of really rich people. Like, why don't we try getting money from them? Or what are the risks that comes with that as well?
I'm thinking of your context specifically, Jan. I mean, so I think you know that context well, and you know the people who have the money in those contexts. I know that right now with COVID in Myanmar, they're doing a lot of philanthropy right now, but it typically is, especially at the start of kind of like philanthropic journeys for new wealth, it typically is like kind of education funding, healthcare, basic needs. So that's maybe not that surprising. The other aspect is, of course, who has the money and how much you want to be associated with them in certain contexts. I think that's a mild way of putting it. I don't think that's entirely the case. And what I've noticed when I'm looking at philanthropic funding more generally is the second generation could be a bit more liberal, could be a bit more kind of willing to be risky and innovative. But typically, unfortunately, for the work that you do, Jan, and like our kind of audience here, that's around kind of press freedom, independent media, holding power to account, financial transparency, a lot of the wealth is kind of implicated in some of these issues, so it's pretty tricky, and maybe it's not the right timing, unfortunately. I would like to see it though, and I'm wondering if it's not within home countries, but elsewhere in Asia. We tap into Taiwan, South Korea. That's kind of interest to me as well.
Hey, Dee, I'm not sure if your mic is working right now, is it? If it is, please jump in with your question.
But she's also on mute.
Oh, okay. So maybe it's not working then.
Okay, Alan, you ask Dee's question for her.
So this is a question that Dee's asked our previous speakers as well. Is there an unspoken rule about the maximum percentage of the ask versus what's on offer? Also, should you ask for more or less than you need?
That's a good question, and it really depends on the organization. I think there are some unspoken rules for a lot of funders that I know. some people say 15 to 20% of the budget, but there are other funders that are looking to be angels and seed funders, and they are hoping to seed organizations as explicit part of their strategy. I think that's a question that's not particularly asked enough as well during the funding conversation. Sometimes, though, I guess I don't perceive it as. Let me think about this. I think there's two ways of thinking about this. One, if you ask for too much money, funders may be worried that you would be entirely reliant on them, and if they decide not to continue the funding, like this dependency is a real fear, because then they're not funding you if their priorities change, or if they, for whatever reason, don't want to, then your organization might fall apart. So there is a reason why they kind of keep to that number. But on the other hand, it also doesn't hurt to ask for more money. I do feel like organizations sometimes are a little bit conservative in the ask. And what's the worst, right? I just say no. Like, sorry, we can't do this, but we can do this year. What about a top up next year? Wouldn't that be a nice conversation to have?
Nice. So kind of segue a top up conversation into your ask as well, maybe
as part of the long term part. Yeah.
Right. So you could ask for maybe core funding, and then say that I'm planning to launch these products, and so I'd need top ups for these audiences. Maybe.
If you can't do it this year, can you do it next year? I mean, I think having that open flow of conversation is quite helpful, and it's normally probably doesn't happen because it's all very mysterious what the process is, what the funding cycle is from the other side, is my perception.
Sure. No, absolutely. Dee is saying, I think I can make out from the sign language that kind of answers her question. Myrna, you had a cool question about spam. Go for it.
Yes. Hi. So my question is, since you focused quite a bit about investing in a relationship past the grant, how do we keep that up without it being a spam? Say, for example, if I'm sending newsletters, or like I'm informing my donors about things that are happening in my organization, do we do that as person working in an organization, or do I do that on a personal level? So I kind of build a relationship with someone within the donor agency, and then we take it from there.
I think you want to work on both ways at once. One, because of course the personal relationship is probably like building a champion within your organization is probably going to be the most effective way of having this long-term relationship. On the other hand, because people do move around and leave, all eggs in one basket is probably not a good idea too. And so kind of having institutional level kind of communication is good. When you do institutional level communication, you could be sending your newsletter, but unfortunately we get a ton of newsletters, all of us do. Your inbox and my inbox is full of Alan's Friday newsletter and other things. So I think what may be useful is personalizing a little bit. Hey, this is in this newsletter this week. Hi, funder. I thought you might be interested. This specific article in this newsletter this week, I thought of you and the kind of things you're going through when we produce that. Something like that. It creates a touch point that it's a little bit more personalized. It does take effort, of course. And if you have a bunch of funders, you're doing it for a bunch of people, time consuming, but that's why people have fundraising teams, I guess. But even the newsletter itself, popping into your inbox, once a week does keep at least kind of brand name recognition and kind of top of mind. So, I should remember this organization when I'm looking for XYZ.
That reminds me, Alan, we should revive our newsletters at some point.
I was hoping you wouldn't say that. We would highly recommend newsletters, though. But that said, it is a lot of work showing up in your inboxes twice a week. But yes, at some point we need to do that. So I get the benefit of asking the final question before we wrap up here. So when you look around the region and you look around the ecosystem, Melanie, what is the biggest gap that you see that needs to be solved through an organization like yours or other donors in this space?
I think the gap is really what I was talking about, the fragmentation. There's people doing bits of pieces here and there, and it's all short term. So, I think from the funder's perspective, that's a very big gap. We obviously need philanthropy is just going to be a band-aid. We can't solve the real pressing issues that media is undergoing right now. And its long-term sustainability is in no way going to be solved by the likes of Luminate and others. I am very happy to work with MDIF, for example, in the region on the technical assistance program, which is really about training, getting newsrooms or getting news businesses to work on their business models. So I think the work that Tessa Piper is doing on that front is really important. I think the work that you're doing, Rashad and Ellen, kind of on your innovation and transformation, those programs, those are really important. It's like the membership experiments that are going on. I mean, we need to chart a way forward, and this is where there's been a huge gap.
So good. Well, people, that was Melanie Hui, your agony aunt, for the most important relationship, arguably, in your life, the one that you have with your donor. And if you don't have a donor or a relationship with one, maybe it's time you launched a media startup like Corinne Podger is going to do, like, D at Plates Magazine already has done, like Darate Din has already done, like so many of you. I mean, work on your relationships. They're out there, and Pat Bird and Melanie are really, really approachable. They've got email addresses, they're real human beings, and they have nice smiles, and they're really smart. So get in touch with them. Thank you, guys. How good this has been. So good. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you, Melanie. And thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thanks for
a lot.
coming.